The historical relationship between the Austro-Habsburgs and the Ottomans is a very changeable one, which gained momentum especially from the 16th century onwards with the Ottoman expansion into Europe. When the Ottomans suddenly became neighbors of the Habsburgs after the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, their contact increased, both on a political and cultural level. The two Turkish sieges of Vienna in 1529 and 1683 were as well very significant moments in the empire's shared history. Although the relationship between them, and thus their perceptions and dealings with each other, is usually examined under an oppositional framework, the relationship was much more complex. Depending on the time and the region of the Habsburg Empire, there were different connotations in the perception of the Ottomans. In addition to the wars, diplomatic and trade relations had an important role to play. Through them, other sides of the Ottomans got to be known and even appreciated, thus reflecting the actually multi-layered relationship with the Ottomans. Especially in the 18th century, the image of the Turks became more and more complex. The borderland between the Habsburg Empire and Ottoman Hungary takes a special stance in this respect. This geographical zone shifted significantly between the 16th and the 18th century, causing changes within the society of this region as well. Also, in the borderlands, a more ambiguous relationship developed. For example, in times of war, trade between the local populations of the two empires still took place, and in times of peace, raids were still carried out against each other. It seems that these regions acted partly autonomously in relation to their neighbors, far from the centers of government and thus detached from imperial agendas. And therefore, in these regions, the perception of each other and behavior towards each other was more fluid. Obviously, there was also the desire to create certain notions and memories of the Ottomans to serve the Habsburgs' own political agenda. Therefore, certain narratives about the Ottomans were enforced, and material as well as immaterial heritage was adjusted or even created, all with the intention of preserving or erasing certain memories. Probably the most familiar example of Ottoman material culture used in the Habsburg Empire for memory creation are the objects of booty. They included weapons, armor, tents, among other types of objects, and were widely collected and exhibited since the 16th century on, at court, in monasteries, but also by noblemen. Some of the Ottoman objects were modified to eliminate Islamic symbolism, including Arabic inscriptions. These elements could also be substituted with Christian or more general European iconography. By doing so, it was tried to disguise the Islamic identity of the object in order to make the object adequate for their own use, thus for a Christian space. At the same time, this must be understood as an act of power demonstration, signifying the historical triumph over the Ottomans. Contrary, the hybrid objects can also be understood as a reminder of a shared history or the acceptance that the Ottomans are also part of the Habsburgs' own past and thus identity. In other instances, the captured objects were not altered and were rather appreciated for their original aesthetics, thus cultivating the memory of the Ottomans as being cultured craftsmen rather than barbaric enemies. Then again, within the aristocratic collections in the Habsburg Empire, these Ottoman objects were seen as treasured family memorabilia, as they bore witness to the ancestors' participation in Turkish wars and sieges for generations to come. Also, the choice of what was collected and the ways in which it was displayed, in other words, the politics behind it, was significant for the cultivation of certain memories. As mentioned before, noble collections of Ottoman booty would serve the remembrance of the triumphs of the own family. However, there were also other forms of collecting Ottoman objects. Especially in the 16th century, curiosity cabinets were quite common amongst members of the ruling houses, and also in the Habsburg Empire. One of them was the Ambras collection of Archduke Ferdinand II of Tyrol, which he founded in the mid of 16th century in Tyrol, Austria. He collected with preference not only Ottoman objects but also pieces from all over Europe and Asia. The Ottoman objects were, however, not exhibited as war trophies, but rather together on equal grounds with other weapons, including Austrian ones. It seems that the driving force behind Ferdinand II's collection is not the idea of the defeat of a pagan enemy, but more the fascination for military objects and historically significant battles in general. Perhaps this could be explained by the fact that Ferdinand himself was only marginally involved in battles against the Ottomans. Thus, in this case, the nature of the display helped more to manifest the cultural and artistic value of the objects. Monuments or objects in public space also contributed significantly to the shaping and preservation of certain memories of the Ottomans. One example is the former spire of St. Stephen's Cathedral, which was installed there in the year 1519. It consists of a crescent moon in which a star is inscribed. The removal of the spire is linked to a change in Habsburg's perception of the Ottomans. Initially, the spire was installed during a time of Ottoman threat, 10 years before the First Siege of Vienna, which took place in 1529. It was believed that the spire would be seen from afar by the Ottomans and might make them have some sort of mercy with the city of Vienna. However, over the course of the 16th and 17th century, the perception of the symbol changed amongst society. After the First Siege of Vienna was overcome without greater harm, contemporary texts report that the symbol was seen more and more as blasphemous, since it was an Islamic symbol on a Christian church. However, the latest, after the Second Siege of Vienna, the general sentiment was against the spire. So it was removed from the cathedral in 1686. This was 3 years after the Second Siege of Vienna. When it was taken down, it was etched with the Latin words, Haec Solimane Memoria Tua, and the date 1529, to remember the victory over the Ottomans in this year. Together with the depicted hand gesture on the spire, the object became a symbol for the new self-confidence towards the Ottomans. As initially it was installed with the intention to accommodate the Ottomans out of fear, and after the 2-1 sieges, it was more a means to portray their own superiority and victories over the Ottomans. Thus, this object is a testimony of the changing relations to the Ottomans. In the 18th century, during the time of the long Turkish wars, the perception and memory of the Ottomans became increasingly complex and multi-layered. On the one hand, the thought of the sieges, of the Viennese sieges, is still there, and also the current military conflicts in Eastern Europe with the Ottomans fuel altogether the image of them as the enemy. At the same time, the image of the Ottomans is also influenced by the emergent exoticism that was spreading throughout Europe. There was a fascination with the Turks as they were increasingly perceived as exotic foreigners. In this context, in the mid-18th century, the Habsburg court in Vienna organized so-called Türkenkopfstechen, meaning quite literally stabbing the Turk's head. For these events, heads that were supposed to look like an Ottoman, made out of cardboard or wood, were produced, and they were usually having like turbans or mustaches as symbols. The head is then placed in the middle of an arena, and horse riders attempt to stab the head. It was a game at that time. Thus, it serves as a playful way of processing the past and the current threat that emanated and still emanates at that time from the Ottomans. At the same moment, however, we see the fashion à la Turca, Türkenmode, emerging at the Viennese court. Even Maria Therese had herself depicted in a portrait from 1743 wearing a Turkish harem costume. Also, costume books were produced that showed Ottoman clothing as well as other exotic dresses. There were also operas and theater plays written that featured the Turk as a figure. During the 18th century, quite clearly, the memories of the Ottomans as military opponents and as esteemed and cultured foreigners became intermingled. It can be summarized that in the Habsburg Empire, memories formed the image of the Turk, but also vice versa. Prevailing assumptions and ideas about the Ottomans became some sort of lens through which the past was looked at. An interdependency between perception and memory developed. There is a certain number of characters that the Turk is portrayed as that continuously occur from the 16th to the 18th century, such as the exotic, the religious and military enemy, the barbaric, but also the cultured and the skilled. By using these categories to deal with the memories and legacies of the Ottomans, a way was found to cope with their own complex relationship with them.